Hello, my name's Roger Watson. I'm the Editor-in-Chief of Nurse Education in Practice. I'm going to talk to you for the next 10 minutes about the 4 rules of writing. Now, these are my 4 rules of writing. Other people have got 3, other people have got 4, some have 5. One of my colleagues has got 7 rules for writing. But I think my 4 rules are the minimum rules that you need to make progress with your academic writing and to write effectively. By effectively, I mean in such a way that you maximize your opportunity of being accepted. And that's the aim of writing academic manuscripts, to be accepted and to be published. So these are my 4 rules. They've served me very well in my own academic publishing career, and I've also used them to advise colleagues and research students when they've asked me for advice about writing. This, of course, is only one aspect of writing academic papers, but I think it's a good place to start. So I'll tell you what my 4 rules are, and then I will go through each of them in turn, explaining what I mean in a little bit more detail. My 4 rules for writing are, first of all, 1, read the guidelines. I'll explain what that means. 2, count words and set yourself targets for writing. My 3rd rule is to consult someone, get some criticism about your writing before you submit it, especially if you're an inexperienced or novice writer. And the 4th rule is to always treat a rejection by one journal as the opportunity to submit to another journal. Don't give up. So I'll take each of these in turn. Read the guidelines. The guidelines for a journal should be easy to find. All journals are online these days, and the guidance for authors, or guidelines for authors, it has slightly different names, should be prominent on the landing page for the journal. If not, they may be under something like further information or information for authors, alongside which you'll get other information about writing for the journal, what they expect, and how to submit your paper. However, make sure that you always consult the guidelines before you start writing a paper. I would say more than that. I would always have a specific journal in mind before you begin writing, because that helps you to write the paper properly for that journal. Of course, different journals will have different guidelines. You may have to adjust these if you get rejected and have to submit again. Anyway, back to the guidelines. The guidelines for a journal will tell you many things. In fact, they should tell you everything that you need to know about submitting an article to that journal. The guidelines, please be aware, are updated regularly. And as an editor, I certainly update mine at least annually, but we often update them throughout the year as new publishing practices come in, and also as authors bring to our attention that some aspects of the guidelines are incongruous or not or hard to understand. So we're always trying to make the guidelines as comprehensive and as clear as possible. So they contain a great many details, not all of which you need to know for any particular paper. So the first thing I would say is to check what kind of manuscript that you're submitting, what kind of study have you done, and seek the guidance specifically for that kind of manuscript. So for example, systematic reviews will have different sets of guidance from randomized controlled trials, for example. Anyway, that's a sort of starting point. The guidelines will tell you, beyond that, some very important things. First of all, they will tell you what the length of the expected manuscript is. That doesn't mean to say that you have to write one as long as that, but that's the maximum length. And journals are very, very strict about this. So it has to be written within a certain length. They will tell you what the structure of the paper is, and the structure of the paper is something that we'll talk about later in some other session. But the structure is really the headings and subheadings within the paper. Again, very important that you get these right, and particularly that you get the structure of the abstract correct, because very often, if it's not correct, the editor-in-chief who receives the paper may not read it any further. And the third thing, important thing to get right, is the referencing system. that will be clear there. Now, there are lots of other details like how to present statistics, which equator guidelines to use and so forth. There's lots of other smaller bits of guidance, some specific to the paper, some specific to every paper, but the big ones are getting the length, getting the structure, and getting the referencing system right. I would say without hesitation that there is absolutely no excuse not to get these things correct when you are writing and submitting an academic paper. So that's the first of the guidelines, first of the 4 rules is to read the guidelines. The second is to count words and to set yourself targets. Every good writer does this. So a manuscript may be required to be 5,000 words in length. Do not ever sit down with the intention of writing the whole 5,000 words at once. It's very unlikely that you'll be able to achieve it. You should break the task down over several days, and one of the ways you can do this is to count the number of words that you're writing. So my target every time I sit down to write anything, a piece of writing, is for that session when I'm sitting down is to write at least 500 words. Sometimes that's all I will write in a day, but I will do the writing in 500 word sections. That's a reasonable amount of writing to do. If you're writing in a second language, then it may be harder. You may have to write only 250 words. It's up to you entirely, but you should have a target. And you need to count the words as you're going along to make sure that you're achieving those targets and not to go beyond. If you go beyond your targets, you may become discouraged by not being able to reach the next target. So try to have targets and try to stop when you reach them. And one of the tricks that I have concerned with writing to targets is when I come to the end of a section of writing and I may still have ideas in my head, what I will do is I'll jot those down as bullet points, save the file, and then when I open it up again, those bullet points will be the places where I can start writing again. So you give yourself a thread to pick up when you start writing. Another thing I should say, it's not so much a rule, it's just common sense. Please make sure that you always back up your files and date them or identify them in some way so that you know what the latest version is, but don't delete and discard files. Always back them up somewhere separately. So that's the first 2 rules. Read the guidelines, count the words, and write to targets. The third of my 4 guidelines, and this is especially the case for inexperienced or novice writers, or maybe someone writing in a second language, is always have someone to look over your article critically. If you're working with a team or working with a senior colleague, then they will naturally do this. If you're writing on your own, or if you're writing with a group of people who are not experienced writers, then do make sure that somebody else takes a look at it. They don't necessarily have to be an expert, just someone who can read the paper and point out to you if there are any parts of that manuscript that don't make sense, and you should address those. It's always helpful to do that. So the first of the 3 rules, read the guidelines is the first one, and then count words and write to targets. And the third rule is to seek some external criticism of your writing. Find a friendly colleague. Don't find someone who is very difficult to speak to or who's always going to tell you that the work is bad. Find someone who is constructive. And the 4th rule, which is as important as any of the other ones, and it should be almost like a default setting for academic writers, is treat every rejection as the beginning of the next submission. So if you're rejected by one journal, it's not a personal rejection. It doesn't mean to say that your work is no good. There are no rules about where you can submit it again. You should take any information or any review comments that are given to you into account, try to improve the paper, find another journal and start again. You'll have to read the guidelines again. You may have to do some rewriting, so you may have to count words and set yourself targets, and again get someone to look over the paper before you submit it. You don't want the first person who's looking at a paper to be the editor, that's for sure. So those are the 4 rules of writing. The first of my 4 rules, I'll reiterate, is to read the guidance. The second rule is to count the words that you're writing and work to specific targets. The third rule is to have someone looking over your work and giving you some constructive criticism. And the 4th rule, and possibly the most important one, because you will be rejected at some points, is to treat every rejection as the beginning of